Apothecary Podcast. Authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Pod guests share their desert island drugs and joyful patient stories.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast. This is episode 5. The news is, due to popular demand, we've decided that we will be doing a second series. Great news, I know you'll agree. Coming up in today's episode of the Oral Apothecary, we're joined by Lindsay Harper. Lindsay is the Director of Pharmacy at the Salford Royal Care Organisation. Our micro-discussion will look at the implications of the recent New England Journal of Medicine paper on the role of once-weekly semaglutide in obesity. Not forgetting that Lindsay will share with us her desert island drug, her career anthem, and a book for the Oral Apothecary Library. So people have been asking me, how did you choose STC and Gimmo? Well, when I started the search for my two fellow apothecaries to join me on this journey, from the hundreds of applications, the auditions, the live shows, the two lucky competition winners are here tonight. So STC is in Bournemouth, and we will start with Gimmo in Cardiff. Welcome both.
Evening.
Thanks, Jamie, and I was obviously honoured that you chose me to be part of this podcast, so thank you very much. So I was just going to mention something that happened to me today, actually. So the current Mrs. Gibson, she's had a bit of an allergic reaction. Well, I'll say a bit. She's actually had a really nasty allergic reaction to something. We're not sure what. And she's come out in some sort of, hives and skin rash. And so I had a bit of a taste of the future, really, because she sort of rang the doctor first thing in the morning. She was taking photos of her rash, later on in the day. We posted those via, I think it's something called eConsult, to the doctor. And I was picking up the steroids and other stuff, antihistamines, by tea time. I know these are the sort of things we're talking about, but it was actually first-hand experience for me as a patient. So great service. Big shout out to Cruise Road Surgery and Plains Pharmacy in Cardiff. Thank you very much. So yeah.
Very good. And please send our best wishes to the current Mrs. Gibson. That is, we wish her a speedy recovery.
Yeah. How long do we think she'll be the current Mrs. Gibson? No, we can't ask that question.
Today, I've been busy today remember Claire Howard in episode 2 talked about polypharmacy and prescribing action learning sets?
Indeed.
Well, I've been running or helped run some action learning sets with the Cardiff Business School for the executive MBA students. And so that's been an interesting day today, 2 sessions on Zoom. STC?
Well, as you've learned, if I'm not Zooming, I'm basically listening to podcasts. So I'm going all in on podcasts, and I'm one of these mad people that goes swimming in the sea every week without a wetsuit, I hasten to add. And I was talking to one of my fellow swimmers at the weekend. We're talking about podcasts, and she said, "Oh, you need to listen to The Eternal Debate." And I said, "Ooh, that sounds quite good. What's that?" She said, "It's about embalming and all things to do with rigor mortis and mortuary technicians." I forgot that she actually is a mortuary technician. So I had a listen, and it's really funny. I know, James, you've been talking about humour, haven't you? And what do you say? What's the key bit about humour?
Where there's truth, there's humour.
Exactly right. So that was great.
Very deadpan though, Steve, was it?
Yeah, indeed it was. No, it's very funny, actually. 2 northern people and very good chemistry, I have to say. And the other one is another Stephen Dubner from Freakonomics called No Stupid Questions. And they talk about, have we lost our ability to compromise? And this really resonated with me, particularly on social media. I know we rely on social media for the Oral Apothecary, but this idea that, we're all in an echo chamber and we only want to hear the things that we want to hear. It was talking about it in relation to all sorts of life, not just political, but this idea that we have perhaps lost the ability to compromise. So we've said that this is going to be authentic and edgy, and I think that's what we're aiming to do. So people aren't always going to agree with what we say.
Do we need to apologise to anybody yet? That's what I was just clarifying. We've been going, this is episode 5. Have we offended anybody?
Probably the current Mrs. Gibson.
Well, you started with the current Mrs. Gibson.
No, I don't think we have yet. I don't think we have.
Well, that's okay. We just need to keep checking that. Okay, back to STC now then to introduce our special guest for this episode.
Yes, I'd like to introduce to the Oral Apothecary Lindsay Harper. Lindsay and I spent many years in Manchester, Lindsay working at Salford and myself working in Wythenshawe, and we worked at the University of Manchester teaching a lot of students. And as Jamie said in the introduction, I'm very, very pleased to have seen Lindsay make it all the way to chief pharmacist. In fact, not just Salford Hospital now, but it also includes the Pennine Trust as well. You've got some fancy name I can't remember, Lindsay. I think it's brilliant that somebody who comes from a very clinical background has made it all the way to chief pharmacist. And we wanted to get on the Oral Apothecary somebody to talk up to us about what's been happening in hospital pharmacy in the future. So
I hope we haven't lost it to clinical services. That's what I'm sure. If we made it all the way to chief pharmacist, I hope we haven't lost your clinical services skills, Lindsay.
No, not at all. I would say that the best chief pharmacists are ones who come from clinical, so that we actually remember what it was like. But I must admit now, each year I become a chief pharmacist, I probably am a bit more distant.
Yeah.
But I still think the fact is I remember that the patient is at the end of it. So I think the best chief pharmacists are from clinical.
Yeah. And you come from an intestinal failure specialism, don't you? So nutrition and things to do with that. And I learned a lot from you in relation to that. So obviously it would be remiss for you to remark, I suppose, about what's been happening during the pandemic and how stressful it must have been for everybody working in a hospital. And then perhaps tell us about what you've got on the horizon for the rest of this year and beyond.
I think what was difficult about the pandemic was that we were just starting from scratch. We had to relearn everything. We had to change all the procedures, policies, and nobody knew the answer. And so in some ways you were having to work on your own and try and change everything. People were probably nervous about being out. I feel in some ways that I've had a much easier time. I've not been on the front line, on the wards. We've had pharmacists who having to be in full PPE. So I think they're the real heroes, the people who were there. But lots of unexpected things came out. I think the first surge was much easier. I think there was much more goodwill. But I think now that we're in the second or third surge, I think people feel really tired. It's everything you see on the news, isn't it, in that respect? But I think it's a bit like it's been the best of times and the worst of times all at once. And so we've seen some really good things happen, but we've seen some really difficult times as well. And I think what's been hard is that some of our members of staff, in some of the consultants, some of the nurses actually ended up on our intensive care. So that was quite a difficult time when you're actually nursing people who that made it all the more real, I think, in that respect.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So what do you think is on the horizon? What is your number one thing if we're trying to look forward beyond COVID? What's your number one thing is in your inbox?
Can I have two?
If they're related.
I'm going to be a difficult guest.
We'll edit you out, Lindsay, don't worry.
Yeah, it's fine. You can. And the fact is, the first thing we need to think about recovery. And I think as we're coming out of the pandemic, we know we're now getting into recovery. We've got lots of patients to see. We've got a lot of surgery. And the whole way we do medicine is going to be really different. And the fact is that so many things are going virtual. So in the way that, Gimmo, you talked about having the virtual discussion with your GP, that's exactly what's going to be in the same way for hospitals. So the traditional way of a patient coming in, seeing a doctor, getting a prescription, going home. And so we need to think about how can we have pharmacy supporting those virtual clinics? How do we get those medicines out to patients? We've got a virtual COVID ward in our hospital now, so we have about 100 patients who are still under the hospital but not physically in it. So how do we get the medicines out there, and how do we as pharmacy make the prescribing safe? We're lucky that they're on the electronic prescribing system so we can still see what they're getting, but we can't do pharmacy the traditional way that we would in being able to go to the ward, have a ward round as such. But how are we going to support that one? And so I think, how are we going to design our pharmacy services for that? And I don't have all the answers yet, but it'll come. And I suppose the second thing was talking about systems leadership and about having integrated pharmacy teams. And I think that will also come out from the pandemic. We've already got that document from Keith Ridge where his aim is that he wants to have a systems lead chief pharmacist in each area. But we need to think about how within our locality can we design pharmacy teams. So at Salford, we've already started that, and the fact is that the GP practice pharmacists are employed by Salford Royal. We've got the care homes pharmacists. We've also now started to do some of the discharge to assess wards, and we actually have our same pharmacists in the clinical teams. So I think the one area we haven't managed to have links with is community pharmacy. So how do we bring that into the team? I think it is good that we're all employed by the same organisation, so we actually know each other. So if you've got a problem in the community, you know exactly who to ring in the hospital and vice versa. And we've just set up a system-wide medicine safety committee. So actually we can begin to talk about what are the issues. So we're lucky we have electronic systems. So we've started doing an electronic medicines incident. So we actually can tell what kind of medicines are causing admission to hospital. So one project is we could see that anticoagulants was causing admissions, which wasn't really a surprise to anyone.
No, not at all.
No, and so then we've set up a project in the GP practices looking at those patients coming out of hospital on anticoagulants. So we're addressing what we're seeing as some of the reasons why they come into hospital. We are then doing some projects across the whole system to actually try and improve patient safety.
Yeah, so just for the listener, Salford is actually quite unique, isn't it, in that it's always been very, very well connected. So the hospital, you can see, can't you, into the GP record, and the GPs can see into the hospital record. And that's been, what, 10 years plus?
Yes, it's been quite good that the GP practice pharmacists, a lot of them have come from the hospital. So they know their way around our electronic patient records, so they can actually find information quite quickly, even out in the community.
I'm interested when you talked about recovery, because we touched on that last week. So I'm chatting to quite a few people out there, and I'm, you know, myself included, is what you said, is everyone's really tired. This second wave or this third wave, whatever you want to call it, doesn't have the same energy and that was in the first one, when there was sort of more of a esprit de corps type thing, wasn't it? And I think what worries me is that we go straight into recovery without a rest. And that's just, I don't know if that's something that you've been thinking about, but I think it's going to be difficult to do that because it's urgent that we get on with turning things around. But I do worry about the workforce because I think they're exhausted.
And that's what Lawrence Brad said on the last episode, didn't he?
Mm-hmm.
It's the risk of burnout and us all needing to work as a team. So that's where the integrated care idea, so I work in Dorset and it's actually been one of the pilot sites. So if it can't work in Dorset, it won't work anywhere. You know, we've got 2 councils, we've got 3 hospitals. If we can't do it, nobody can. But it's a natural progression for us. It will be more difficult in other places. But yeah, I think it's a no-brainer. And it comes with a new white paper as well in England.
Lindsay, you're one of the few chief pharmacists I've heard describe it as a positive that many of your GP practice pharmacists have come from hospital.
I know.
Which is good to hear.
Yeah. And I think that's when they started talking about having the integrated team and having the hospital employing the pharmacists. There was a degree of suspicion from the GPs to begin with, because I think they thought that the hospital was trying to take over. But actually, I could see that the only way I was going to maintain my staff was actually, if I was employing them, I have a degree of control, because otherwise I could lose all those pharmacists and all the expertise, whereas now we can actually use the skills either in community or in the hospital. But I do think the one area we've not managed to really tap into is the community pharmacists. We do have farm outcomes that's been built into our electronic prescribing system. So we do the referrals to the community pharmacists. And the good thing is that because we're doing it through the EPR, the GP practice pharmacists can begin to see when that referral's been made. So that means that we're beginning to have some communication at discharge, but I still think we've got a lot of work to do and we need to improve that.
Along those lines, what, job variation and the risk of, pharmacists getting bored with their lot of doing the same thing day in, day out, no matter how useful it is. What are your thoughts on that?
It's been quite interesting in that when we first started with the GP practice pharmacists, we had some junior pharmacists of the band 7 who were working half in the hospital and half in the community, and we thought that would be quite a good job, that they would get experience of everything. But we found that actually that was too much of a challenge, and they found it to try and balance 2 jobs. And so we found now that having half a week in one and half a week in the other, it was very difficult for them to manage to cope with all the responsibilities they had. So we found it's much better to do whole 6-month rotations, either into the hospital, then 6 months out into the community. So I think as you're first starting in your career, having a bit of continuity is actually quite helpful. For the more senior pharmacists, I think they managed to balance it. But it was just what we found, that the pharmacists found it quite difficult when they were doing both at the same time. How are we going to get on with the foundation? I'm not sure, because we're going to have that challenge.
That's for another podcast.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. And we will take that on as well. So I must just say, I don't know who deals with all new NHS jargon and terms, but there's one that's just driving me around the nuts, and that is the word place. What on earth does that mean? But anyway, let's not go there. You don't have that in Wales and you don't want it. Anyway, obviously the main reason for coming on the Oral Apothecary, Lindsay, is for you to give us one of your desert island drugs. So what would you like to give us?
So my drug is infliximab. The reason why I chose that one is, as an intestinal failure pharmacist, I first started in intestinal failure in one of the national units at Salford back in 1996. And by far and away, the largest number of patients on those wards were Crohn's patients. And a lot of them had lost a huge amount of their small bowel. So we were looking after patients who maybe only had about 10 centimetres of small bowel left due to their Crohn's. And the challenges that come with that, of trying to get all the different medicines into those patients, was a real challenge. In some ways, I quite liked that because it felt like I was a proper pharmacist, because I'm almost having